Hidden in a remote forest stands a dilapidated cabin, its broken walls and leaking roof a testament to years of neglect. When James, a homeless man seeking shelter from winter's approach, discovers this abandoned sanctuary, he sees more than decay. He sees hope. Drawing on skills learned through a lifetime of hardship, he begins the painstaking work of restoration, unaware that the property belongs to Sarah Mitchell, a billionaire searching for refuge from a world that only sees her bank account. When she arrives to find her rundown cabin transformed and meets the man who expects nothing but simple conversation, two vastly different worlds collide. As their unlikely connection deepens, they must confront the question, can love bridge the gap between fortune and simplicity? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn wind whispered through the trees as James Cooper pulled his threadbare jacket tighter around his shoulders. His calloused fingers brushed against the worn leather wallet in his pocket, not for the money it held, for there was none, but for the faded photograph tucked inside its creased folds. The image showed happier times, a younger James standing proud in front of his own construction company's sign, his arm around his late wife, Marie. 20 years of honest work, shattered by a perfect storm of misfortune. First came Marie's illness, then the mounting medical bills that drained their savings. The recession dealt the final blow, forcing him to close the business he'd built from the ground up. The mortgage followed, then the car, until everything he'd worked for slipped through his fingers like sand. But James wasn't the type of man to let bitterness take root. Even now, pushing 60 with nothing but a backpack containing spare clothes, basic tools, and that precious wallet, he held his head high. The skills that had once built his business remained intact, knowledge earned through decades of transforming raw materials into homes for others. The forest path ahead wound deeper into the New England wilderness. He'd been following it for 3 days, moving away from the overcrowded shelters of Boston, seeking something he couldn't quite name. Perhaps it was dignity, or maybe just peace. The local townspeople had mentioned abandoned properties scattered throughout these woods, remnants of summer homes left to nature's devices. His boots crunched over fallen leaves as he paused to check his surroundings. The late afternoon sun filtered through the canopy, casting dappled shadows on the forest floor. A cluster of wild mushrooms caught his eye, edible ones he noted with satisfaction. Years of camping in work sites had taught him basic foraging skills that now proved invaluable. James reached down to carefully harvest the mushrooms, adding them to the small collection of wild edibles in his pack. Each one represented another meal, another day of independence. He'd learned to find satisfaction in these small victories, these moments of self-reliance that reminded him he wasn't completely powerless. The path curved sharply around a massive oak tree, and that's when he saw it. Through a break in the foliage stood a cabin, its grey wooden sides weathered by countless seasons. The roof sagged dangerously, 2 windows were broken, and the front porch listed to one side like a tired soldier. But to James's experienced eye, the foundation looked solid. The basic structure beneath all the damage held promise. He approached cautiously, years on the streets having taught him the importance of careful observation. No fresh tire tracks marked the overgrown driveway. No recent footprints disturbed the carpet of leaves. The metal mailbox at the end of the path had rusted shut, its flag frozen in an eternal upward salute to passers-by who no longer came. Standing before the cabin's weather-beaten door, James pulled out his wife's photograph once more. Marie's smile seemed to encourage him, as it had through countless difficult decisions. "What do you think, honey?" he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "Think we found something worth saving?" A gentle breeze stirred the trees, carrying with it the crisp scent of approaching winter. James knew he had perhaps 2 months before the serious cold set in. 2 months to either turn this forgotten structure into a shelter or move on to face another harsh winter in the city shelters. His fingers traced the splits in the wooden siding, mind already cataloguing needed repairs. The work would be hard, especially alone and with limited tools. But for the first time in years, James felt something that had nothing to do with survival. He felt purpose. The cabin's door yielded with a protesting groan, decades of neglect evident in its rusted hinges. James stepped carefully onto worn floorboards, testing each one before committing his full weight. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light that penetrated the broken windows, illuminating a space that time had forgotten. He moved through the cabin with the practiced eye of a craftsman, mentally cataloguing every flaw and needed repair. The main room was spacious, with a stone fireplace, commanding one wall. Despite the years of abandonment, the chimney looked sound, a blessing that could mean the difference between survival and freezing when winter arrived. A narrow staircase led to what he assumed was a cellar. The steps creaked ominously, but his inspection revealed they were merely suffering from loose nails rather than rot. At the bottom, his flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing shelves of forgotten preserves and, more importantly, a rusted metal toolbox tucked in a corner. James's heart quickened as he carried the toolbox up to the main room. The latch was stuck, but gentle manipulation with his pocket knife eventually freed it. Inside, beneath a layer of dust and cobwebs, lay a treasure trove, a hammer, various screwdrivers, a handsaw, and even a level. The previous owner had been serious about maintenance, though these tools had clearly lain untouched for years. "Well, Marie," he murmured, pulling out the hammer and testing its weight. "Looks like someone's looking out for us after all." He began with the windows, carefully removing the broken panes and boarding them up with salvaged wood from a collapsed shed he'd found behind the cabin. It wasn't pretty, but it would keep out the wind and rain until he could figure out something better. Every nail he pulled was carefully straightened and saved. Resources were too precious to waste. As the day progressed, James settled into a rhythm that felt achingly familiar. His body remembered this work, even if his muscles protested more than they had 20 years ago. He cleared debris, swept decades of dirt from corners, and discovered that beneath the grime, most of the floorboards were solid oak, built to last. The roof would be his biggest challenge. From inside, he could see patches of sky through holes in the ceiling, and water damage marked the walls beneath these gaps. Without proper materials, a complete repair would be impossible, but he could at least minimize the damage. He found a pile of old tin sheets behind the cabin that could serve as temporary patches. As sunset approached, James sat on the front step, sipping water from his canteen and watching the forest grow dark. He'd accomplished more than he'd expected in one day, though his hands were blistered and his back ached. The cabin felt different. Already, less abandoned, more like something with potential. In his pack he found the mushrooms he'd gathered earlier and a handful of wild berries. Not much of a dinner, but he'd had worse. As he ate, he planned the next day's work. The porch needed reinforcement before it collapsed entirely, and he'd seen some loose shingles that he might be able to repurpose for other repairs. Night settled over the forest like a heavy blanket. Inside the cabin, James unrolled his sleeping bag in a corner he'd cleared of debris. The toolbox sat nearby, a reassuring presence in the darkness. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he fell asleep with a sense of purpose, his dreams filled not with anxiety about survival, but with plans for tomorrow. Sarah Mitchell's corner office on the 48th floor offered a panoramic view of Boston's skyline, but she barely noticed it anymore. Instead, her attention was fixed on the newspaper articles spread across her glass desk. Mitchell Tech's Rising Star, how Sarah Mitchell transformed a family business into a billion-dollar empire. The photo showed her at last month's charity gala, perfectly poised in a designer dress, wearing the practiced smile she'd perfected over years of public appearances. "Ms. Mitchell?" Her assistant's voice came through the intercom. "The board members are assembled for the quarterly meeting," Sarah straightened her blazer, tucking away the article into her desk drawer. 5 years as CEO, and still the press seemed fascinated by her story, the daughter who had taken her father's modest software company and turned it into a tech giant. They loved to speculate about her net worth, her investment strategies, her designer wardrobe. Nobody ever asked about the weight of responsibility that came with it all. The boardroom fell silent as she entered, 12 pairs of eyes following her movement to the head of the table. Most of them had known her since she was a child, running through these same halls while her father worked late nights. Now they watched her with a mixture of respect and wariness, never quite forgetting that she was both younger and female in their traditionally male-dominated world. Third quarter projections are up 15%, she began, launching into the presentation. She could practically recite in her sleep. Numbers, strategies, market analysis, the language of power and success that had become her native tongue. But lately, every word felt hollow, rehearsed. Her father's old office, now converted into a meeting room, still held a photograph of their family's first company picnic. Sarah could barely recognize herself in that laughing 12-year-old girl, helping her dad grill hamburgers for their 30 employees. Now Mitchell Tech employed thousands, and she couldn't remember the last time she'd cooked her own meal. After the meeting, Sarah retreated to her office, declining her assistant's offer to order lunch. She opened her laptop, navigating to a folder of personal photos. Behind the quarterly reports and corporate tax documents lay pictures of the cabin, her secret escape that even her closest advisors didn't know about. She'd purchased it 5 years ago, right after taking over as CEO. It had been an impulse buy, spotted in a real estate listing during a particularly stressful week. The agent had been baffled by her interest in such a modest property, especially given its remote location and poor condition. But something about its simplicity, its removal from the world of shareholder meetings and press conferences, had called to her. Yet in 5 years, she'd never found the time to visit. The cabin remained a fantasy, a dream of solitude that always seemed just out of reach. Her calendar was booked months in advance, board meetings, investor presentations, charity events, each one marked in perfect digital precision by her efficiency-obsessed assistant. A notification popped up on her screen. Interview with Financial Times, 30 minutes. Sarah closed the folder of cabin photos with a sigh. Another interview, another carefully crafted story about female empowerment and business acumen. They'd ask about her success, her vision for the company, perhaps throw in a question about work-life balance to seem progressive. She'd give them the answers they wanted, maintain the image they expected. But lately, the facade was wearing thin. Each morning, as she applied her makeup and donned her armor of designer suits, she felt less like a person and more like a carefully constructed brand. Even her closest friends, most of them fellow CEOs or society figures, seemed to interact with her title more than her true self. As she prepared for the interview, Sarah found herself drawn to the window, looking past the city's towers toward the distant hills. Somewhere out there, hidden among the trees, her cabin waited. Maybe it was time to finally use some of those vacation days that had accumulated over the years. Maybe it was time to remember who Sarah Mitchell was, beneath the CEO's polished exterior. Her phone buzzed. The interviewer had arrived. Sarah straightened her shoulders, checked her reflection in the window, and turned back to her desk. But for the first time in years, she felt something stirring beneath the professional facade. A longing for something real, something true, something that couldn't be measured in stock prices or market shares. A week into his restoration work, James discovered the journal. It was tucked away in a kitchen drawer, its leather cover cracked with age, pages warped from years of humidity. Only half the pages had been filled, the last entry dated nearly 2 decades ago. The handwriting spoke of someone who'd loved this place. Detailed observations about bird migrations, sketches of local plants, and notes about repairs made to the cabin over the years. Garden does well with tomatoes. one entry read. Soil's better than it looks. Next spring, try corn. The writer's optimism reached across time, touching something in James's heart. He'd started his own vegetable patch behind his first house, remembered the satisfaction of watching seeds transform into food for his table. As morning light filtered through the newly repaired east window, James sat at the old kitchen table he'd stabilized with careful bracing. The journal lay open before him as he ate the last of his dried fruit. He'd need to make a supply run soon. The nearby town was a good 4-mile walk, but he'd spotted a food bank there during his initial scouting. The past week had transformed the cabin's interior. He'd patched the worst of the roof leaks with salvage materials, cleared decades of debris, and managed to get the old wood stove working again. The previous owner's notes in the journal had helped, pointing out quirks in the cabin's construction that would have taken weeks to discover otherwise. Had to adjust the stove's damper counterclockwise, one entry advised. Seems backward, but works better that way. Such details were gold to James, saving him precious time and energy. He'd taken to adding his own notes in the journal's empty pages, feeling somehow that he owed it to both the previous owner and any future inhabitants. Mid-morning sun found him on the roof, carefully laying tar paper over the patches he'd installed. From this height, he could see the valley stretching out below, trees starting to show their autumn colors. A small herd of deer grazed in a nearby clearing, unbothered by his presence. The journal had mentioned them too, regular visitors to the property, generation after generation. The sound of a truck on the distant road made him pause in his work. Few vehicles passed this way, and those that did usually belonged to locals. Sure enough, an old pickup slowed as it approached the overgrown driveway, its driver clearly curious about the signs of activity at the long-abandoned cabin. James watched as the truck eventually moved on, but he knew it was only a matter of time before someone investigated more closely. The journal mentioned a tight-knit community in the nearby town, people who looked out for each other and knew every property for miles around. He'd need to figure out how to handle that interaction when it came. For now, though, he had work to do. The journal had described a root cellar behind the cabin, its entrance likely hidden by years of undergrowth. Such a space would be invaluable for storing food through the winter, assuming he could restore it. James climbed down from the roof, tools tucked into his belt, and began clearing the thick vegetation behind the cabin. By late afternoon, he'd uncovered the cellar doors, half buried in soil and dead leaves. The heavy wooden doors were swollen with moisture but otherwise solid. Inside, stone walls held steady against the earth, creating a space that stayed cool. Even in summer heat, empty shelves lined the walls, their sturdy construction a testament to the care that had gone into this place. James sat on the cellar steps, journal in hand, adding his own observations about the space. As he wrote, he realized he was doing more than just documenting repairs. He was becoming part of the cabin's story, adding his own chapter to its history. The thought both comforted and unsettled him. How long would this chapter last? How long before circumstances forced him to move on? The journal's unknown author seemed to whisper across the years, plans for next spring. There was something powerful in those words, in the simple act of believing in a future. James looked around the cellar, mentally sketching plans for storage, solutions, improvements he could make. For the first time in years, he too found himself thinking about spring, about possibilities beyond mere survival. That evening, as darkness settled over the forest, James read more of the journal by candlelight. Each entry revealed someone who had found peace in this remote place, someone who understood the profound satisfaction of working with their hands. He fell asleep with the journal nearby, his dreams filled with images of gardens yet to be planted, improvements yet to be made, and a future that for the first time in years held more promise than fear. As October painted the forest in shades of amber and gold, two lives continued on their separate paths, unknowingly drawing closer with each passing day. Sarah sat in her penthouse apartment, absently touching the gold locket that had been her. Mother's, the one piece of jewelry she wore that wasn't chosen for its business-appropriate appearance. Inside was a photo of her parents at the cabin they'd visited during her childhood, before business success had changed everything. 20 miles away, in the growing warmth of a restored wood stove, James added another entry to the cabin's journal. His handwriting, precise despite his calloused hands, recorded the day's achievements: a properly sealed window, a reinforced porch step, a patch of ground cleared for a future garden. The morning found Sarah in a board meeting, half listening to projections for the next fiscal quarter. Her fingers kept returning to the locket, a habit she'd developed when stress threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. The newest board member was pushing for more aggressive expansion, speaking of market dominance and hostile takeovers. "Sometimes," he declared, "you have to tear things down to build them up stronger." Sarah's thoughts drifted to the cabin. She'd been meaning to have it torn down, to build something more suitable for a CEO's retreat. Yet something had always stopped her from making that call. Now, watching the board members' presentation about demolishing smaller companies to absorb their assets, she felt an inexplicable urge to protect that small piece of wilderness. Meanwhile, James stood in the cabin's kitchen, warming his hands around a mug of cheap coffee. Through the window, he watched a family of deer picking their way through the morning mist. One of the younger ones had a slight limp. He'd been leaving out apple cores for them, worried about their chances as winter approached. A knock at his door would have meant questions he couldn't answer, so he'd grown attuned to the sounds of vehicles on the distant road. When a truck slowed near the property's entrance, he quietly moved away from the windows. The journal's previous owner had written about the area's tendency toward gossip, how news traveled faster than the wind through the small community. Back in Boston, Sarah's assistant hovered in her office doorway with the day's schedule. "The charity gala committee needs your input on seating arrangements. There's a journalist from Forbes waiting for a phone interview, and your investment advisor has flagged some concerning movements in the Asian markets." Sarah nodded, slipping the locket beneath her silk blouse. Each task would be handled with the efficiency expected of her, each interaction carefully measured and appropriate. Yet lately, these obligations felt less like achievements and more like chains, golden though they might be. In the cabin's newly organized tool shed, James methodically cleaned the old tools he'd found, remembering how he'd once taught his apprentices the importance of maintenance. "These tools are your livelihood," he'd say. "Treat them with respect, and they'll never let you down." Now, as he worked oil into wooden handles and removed rust from metal surfaces, those words carried a different weight. A local news van drove past the property that afternoon, likely investigating rumors of activity at the abandoned cabin. James stayed inside, checking his repairs to the roof through the gaps in the boarded-up windows. The journal had mentioned property taxes being paid through some trust fund, but he knew his presence here walked a fine line between occupancy and trespassing. Sarah's afternoon consisted of a charity board meeting where Boston's elite competed to demonstrate their generosity. She watched them play their social games, remembering how her father had taught her to navigate these waters. "It's not about the money," he'd said. "It's about understanding what people really want." Looking around the room now, she wondered what any of them truly wanted, herself included. As evening approached, James sat on the restored porch steps, carefully out of sight from the road. He'd found some old wind chimes in the cellar and hung them from the eaves, their gentle music carrying memories of his own front porch from happier days. The journal's previous owner had written about sitting in this same spot, watching the sun set behind the mountains. Some things, it seemed, remained constant despite time's passage. In her penthouse, Sarah stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching city lights replace the setting sun. She'd cancelled her evening appointments, claiming a migraine. Her mother's locket lay open in her palm, the old photo seeming to glow with remembered warmth. On her laptop, the cabin's property records remained open, a tab she found herself returning to more frequently lately, Two lives, separated by circumstance, yet connected by an unseen thread. Two souls seeking something genuine in a world that often felt anything but. As night settled over both city and forest, each felt the stirring of change approaching, like the first hints of dawn while the world still slept. The crunch of tires on gravel broke the morning stillness. James froze at his workbench, where he'd been refinishing salvaged boards for the porch railing. The sound was different from the usual curious drive-bys. This vehicle had turned onto the property's long driveway. Sarah Mitchell guided her Mercedes along the overgrown path, wondering if she'd made a mistake in coming without warning. Her assistant thought she was taking a personal day for meditation and wellness, the only excuse that wouldn't raise corporate eyebrows. She dressed down for the occasion in jeans and a sweater that cost more than most people's monthly rent, though she didn't realize it. The cabin that emerged through the trees stopped her breath. Gone was the sagging wreck from the property. Photos. The roof stood straight. Windows gleamed with new glass, and the front porch, her heart skipped. The front porch had been transformed from a death trap into something that belonged on a postcard. James watched through a gap in the workshop's wall as the luxury car came to a stop. A woman emerged, her designer boots unsuited for the rough terrain. His first thought was, real estate agent. But her bearing suggested ownership. His stomach tightened. He'd known this day would come, had prepared himself for it, yet the reality still felt like a physical blow. Sarah approached the porch slowly, running her hand along the new railing. The wood was smooth beneath her fingers, the craftsmanship evident in every detail. The wind chimes she'd never installed tinkled softly in the breeze. This wasn't just repair work, this was restoration, done with care and respect. "Hello?" she called out, her voice carrying uncertainty she rarely allowed herself to show. "Is anyone here?" James considered his options. He could slip away into the forest. He'd spotted several escape routes during his daily walks. But something in her voice, a note of wonder rather than accusation, made him pause. Squaring his shoulders, he stepped out of the workshop. "Ma'am," he said simply, keeping his distance. Sarah turned, startled. Her first instinct was fear. A strange man in such an isolated location, but his posture was carefully non-threatening. His eyes direct but gentle. She noticed his worn clothes, the tools on his belt, the way he held himself with quiet dignity despite obvious wariness. "Did you do all this?" she asked, gesturing to the improvements. "Yes, ma'am. I apologize for the trespass." His voice carried the weight of experience, of someone used to taking responsibility for their actions. "I can clear out right now if you'd like." Sarah looked back at the porch, noting the careful joinery, the sealed gaps that would keep out winter drafts. "How long have you been working on it?" "About 3 weeks now." James shifted slightly, ready to gather his few possessions at a moment's notice. "I know I should have asked permission, but—" "But?" she prompted when he trailed off. "But sometimes asking permission means being told no before you have a chance to prove your worth." The words came out with quiet dignity, and Sarah felt something twist in her chest. How many times had she faced that same prejudgment in boardrooms and business meetings? "I'm Sarah," she said, deliberately omitting her last name. "Would you show me what else you've done?" Surprise flickered across his weathered features. "Name's James." He hesitated, then gestured to the front door. "I've kept everything as original as possible. Just made it sound again." They entered the cabin together, an unlikely pair connected by the space between them. Sarah noticed immediately how the interior smelled of wood and honest work rather than decay. Sunlight streamed through clean windows, highlighting the restored floorboards and the carefully patched walls. "The previous owner left a journal," James explained, leading her through the main room. "Helped me understand how everything was meant to work." He showed her the wood stove, demonstrated the proper way to adjust the damper, pointed out the reinforced floor joists beneath the kitchen. Sarah found herself drawn into his quiet enthusiasm, the genuine pride he took in doing things right. Here was someone who saw the cabin as she'd always imagined it, not as a property asset, but as a place of refuge and authenticity. The root cellar was quite a find, James continued, then caught himself. I'm sorry. I shouldn't assume you want the full tour. No, please, Sarah said quickly. I'd like to see everything. She didn't mention that this was the longest conversation she'd had in months that didn't involve profit margins or market strategies. As James showed her the improvements he'd made to the cellar's storage system, Sarah made a decision that surprised her with its clarity. Would you be interested in a job? She asked. Making this place properly livable again? James stilled, studying her with careful consideration. Why? It was such a simple question, yet it struck Sarah deeply. When was the last time anyone had asked her why, instead of simply agreeing with whatever she proposed? Because, she said slowly, choosing. Her words with unusual care. You've done more for this place in 3 weeks than I have in 5 years of ownership. Because every repair you've made shows respect for what this cabin is, not what someone might want to turn it into. She paused, then added softly, because maybe this place needs someone who sees its worth beyond its market value. The wind. Chimes tinkled in the autumn breeze, filling the thoughtful silence between them. 2 worlds had collided on this remote mountainside, and in that moment neither was quite sure what to make of the other. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the cabin windows as Sarah watched James prepare a simple meal on the wood stove. He'd offered to make soup from his modest supplies, vegetable stock with foraged mushrooms and wild herbs. She'd never had someone cook for her who wasn't a professional chef, and the domesticity of the moment struck her as both foreign and oddly comforting. You don't have to feed me, she said, sitting at the sturdy kitchen table he'd restored. I can. Order something from town. James stirred the pot slowly, a hint of a smile touching his weathered face. Out here, sharing food means something. My wife Marie used to say a meal made with care was worth more than any fancy restaurant dinner. The mention of his wife was casual, but Sarah caught the gentle shift in his tone. Used to? Cancer, he said simply, adding a pinch of dried thyme to the pot. 8 years ago now, medical bills took everything we had and then some. He spoke without bitterness, stating facts rather than seeking sympathy. Sarah touched her mother's locket reflexively. I lost my mother to cancer too, 3 years ago. She hadn't talked about it since the funeral, where she'd been too busy managing the press and her father's public grief to process her own. James ladled the soup into 2 mismatched bowls he'd found in the cabin's cupboards. The earthenware was old but sturdy, like much of what he'd discovered here. He placed one before Sarah, along with a spoon he'd carefully polished. It's not much, he said, settling across from her with his own bowl. But it's honest food. The soup's aroma filled the kitchen, rich with mushrooms and herbs. Sarah took a careful spoonful, surprised by the depth of flavor. This is wonderful, she said, genuinely impressed. Where did you learn to cook like this? Necessity, mostly. Working construction sites, you learn to make the most of what's available. He broke off a piece of slightly stale bread. The mushrooms grow wild around here. The journal helped me identify the safe ones. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, the wind chimes providing gentle accompaniment. Sarah found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't in years, no one expecting her to lead the conversation, no hidden agendas to navigate. Tell me about the repairs, she said finally. Not just what you did, but why you chose this place. James considered her question, respect for her genuine interest evident in his thoughtful pause. I've built houses for other people my whole life, watched them turn into homes. When I found this cabin, it spoke to me, not just as shelter, but as something worth saving. He went on to explain his initial discoveries, the way the journal had guided his understanding of the cabin's quirks and character. Sarah listened, fascinated by how his technical knowledge blended with an almost philosophical approach to restoration. See this beam? He pointed to a massive timber overhead. Heart pine, They don't cut trees like that anymore. The grain's so tight you can't drive a nail through it without pre-drilling. Took me 3 days to repair the joint properly, but it'll outlast both of us now." "You could have replaced it with something newer," Sarah observed. "Could have," he agreed, "but that'd be like ripping the spine out of a good book just because the binding's worn. Some things deserve to be preserved, not just replaced." His words resonated with something deep inside her. How often had she been pushed to replace rather than restore, to tear down rather than rebuild? The corporate world's constant demand for the new and efficient suddenly seemed hollow compared to this man's quiet wisdom. "What happens when winter comes?" she asked, the question that had been nagging at her since she'd arrived. James met her eyes steadily. "Truth is, I hadn't thought that far ahead. Been focusing on making the place weather-tight, storing what food I can. The journal mentions heavy snows up here." "But you can't just—" Sarah stopped, realizing she wasn't sure how to finish that sentence without sounding condescending. "Stay here indefinitely?" He smiled slightly. "No, I suppose I can't. But sometimes doing the right thing means working on faith that the next step will become clear when it needs to." The soup bowls were empty now, the kitchen growing dim as sunset approached. Sarah found herself reluctant to leave, to return to her world of schedules and expectations. Here, sharing simple food with a stranger who was quickly becoming something else, she felt more herself than she had in years. "That job offer," she said carefully. "I meant it. The cabin needs more work, and you clearly understand it better than any contractor I could hire." James studied her, his expression thoughtful. "Why me? You don't know anything about me. I know you had every opportunity to strip this place of anything valuable. Instead, you restored it. That tells me more than any resume could." Outside, the first stars were becoming visible through the trees. Two people from vastly different worlds sat in the gathering darkness, the simple soup between them worth more than all the business dinners in Sarah's calendar. Over the next few weeks, the cabin became a bridge between two worlds. Sarah found herself inventing excuses to drive up from Boston, each visit stripping away another layer of her corporate armor. James worked steadily, his skilled hands bringing new life to the old structure, while something else quietly took root between them. One crisp morning, Sarah arrived to find James in the workshop, bent over his latest project. His hands moved with practiced precision over a piece of maple wood, transforming it into something both beautiful and functional. She watched from the doorway, noticing how different he looked from their first meeting, still weathered, but with a subtle straightening of his shoulders, a quiet confidence that came from having purpose. "It's a bowl," he explained without looking up, somehow sensing her presence. "Found this maple branch down after the last storm. Wood told me what it wanted to be." His hands never stopped their careful movement as he spoke, the lathe spinning. Beneath his touch, Sarah stepped closer, fascinated by the transformation taking place before her. Curls of wood fell away like golden ribbons, revealing the grain beneath. "I've never seen anything made by hand before," she admitted. "Everything in my world comes from factories, assembly lines." James glanced up then, a small smile touching his eyes. "Nothing wrong with efficiency," he said, "but there's something special about things shaped by human hands. Each piece carries a bit of story with it." He gestured to the partly formed bowl. "This maple grew here, weathered storms, reached for light. Now it's becoming something new, but it keeps its character." The metaphor wasn't lost on Sarah. She thought of her own transformation over these autumn weeks, how each visit to the cabin felt like shedding another layer of artificial polish. She'd stopped wearing designer clothes here after the first few visits, trading them for simple jeans and sweaters that felt more honest somehow. "The repairs are coming along well," James observed, changing the subject. He'd learned to read her moods, to sense when she needed space from heavy thoughts. Root cellars fully stocked now, should hold through winter. Sarah wandered to the workshop window, looking out at the garden he'd started. Even as winter approached, he planned for spring's growth. "You know," she said carefully. "I never asked what your terms would be. For the job, I mean." James set down his tools, giving the question the consideration it deserved. "Honest work for honest pay," he said finally. "And," he hesitated, then continued, "permission to stay on as caretaker. This place needs someone who understands it." The request was simple, yet Sarah heard the deeper meaning beneath it. James wasn't asking for charity or handouts. He was offering a fair exchange, his skills and dedication, for a chance to rebuild his life with dignity. "I have a counter-proposal," she said, turning back to face him. "Full-time position as property manager. The cabin, the grounds, future improvements, room, board, and a proper salary." She swallowed, then added, "And no questions about your past. What matters is the work you do here, now." James was quiet for a long moment, his hands resting on the half-finished bowl. Sarah had learned to appreciate these thoughtful silences, so different from the rapid-fire responses she was used to in business meetings. "Why?" he asked finally. It was the same question he'd asked weeks ago, but now it carried different weight. Sarah's hand went to her mother's locket, a gesture James had come to recognize. "Because this place was meant to be a sanctuary," she said softly. "Not just for me, but for anyone who needs to remember what's real. You understand that better than anyone I've ever met." Just then, a chickadee landed on the workshop's windowsill, pecking at the selection of seeds James had begun leaving out. They both watched it, this small sign of trust from the natural world. "I'll need to go into town," James said after a while. "Get some proper paperwork sorted." His voice held no shame, only practical consideration. "Been a while since I had official employment." Sarah nodded, understanding all he wasn't saying. "I'll make some calls. Have my lawyer handle the details." She smiled slightly. "Unless you think that's too much corporate interference?" He chuckled, the sound warm in the workshop's quiet space. "Sometimes the right tools make the job easier, even if they come from different worlds." The maple bowl sat unfinished on the lathe, a testament to work in progress. Like the cabin, like their growing friendship, it held the promise of something taking shape, something genuine emerging from raw material and careful attention. Over the next few weeks, the cabin became a bridge between two worlds. Sarah found herself inventing excuses to drive up from Boston, each visit stripping away another layer of her corporate armor. James worked steadily, his skilled hands bringing new life to the old structure, while something else quietly took root between them. One crisp morning, Sarah arrived to find James in the workshop, bent over his latest project. His hands moved with practiced precision over a piece of maple wood, transforming it into something both beautiful and functional. She watched from the doorway, noticing how different he looked from their first meeting, still weathered, but with a subtle straightening of his shoulders, a quiet confidence that came from having purpose. "It's a bowl," he explained without looking up, somehow sensing her presence. "Found this maple branch down after the last storm. Wood told me what it wanted to be." His hands never stopped their careful movement as he spoke, the lathe spinning. Beneath his touch, Sarah stepped closer, fascinated by the transformation taking place before her. Curls of wood fell away like golden ribbons, revealing the grain beneath. "I've never seen anything made by hand before," she admitted. "Everything in my world comes from factories, assembly lines." James glanced up then, a small smile touching his eyes. "Nothing wrong with efficiency," he said, "but there's something special about things shaped by human hands. Each piece carries a bit of story with it." He gestured to the partly formed bowl. "This maple grew here, weathered storms, reached for light. Now it's becoming something new, but it keeps its character." The metaphor wasn't lost on Sarah. She thought of her own transformation over these autumn weeks, how each visit to the cabin felt like shedding another layer of artificial polish. She'd stopped wearing designer clothes here after the first few visits, trading them for simple jeans and sweaters that felt more honest somehow. "The repairs are coming along well," James observed, changing the subject. He'd learned to read her moods, to sense when she needed space from heavy thoughts. Root cellars fully stocked now, should hold through winter. Sarah wandered to the workshop window, looking out at the garden he'd started. Even as winter approached, he planned for spring's growth. "You know," she said carefully, "I never asked what your terms would be. For the job, I mean." James set down his tools, giving the question the consideration it deserved. "Honest work for honest pay," he said finally. And he hesitated, then continued, "Permission to stay on as caretaker. This place needs someone who understands it." The request was simple, yet Sarah heard the deeper meaning beneath it. James wasn't asking for charity or handouts. He was offering a fair exchange, his skills and dedication, for a chance to rebuild his life with dignity. "I have a counter-proposal," she said, turning back to face him. "Full-time position as property manager. The cabin, the grounds, future improvements, room, board, and a proper salary." She swallowed, then added, "And no questions about your past. What matters is the work you do here, now." James was quiet for a long moment, his hands resting on the half-finished bowl. Sarah had learned to appreciate these thoughtful silences, so different from the rapid-fire responses she was used to in business meetings. "Why?" he asked finally. It was the same question he'd asked weeks ago, but now it carried different weight. Sarah's hand went to her mother's locket, a gesture James had come to recognize. "Because this place was meant to be a sanctuary," she said softly. "Not just for me, but for anyone who needs to remember what's real. You understand that better than anyone I've ever met." Just then, a chickadee landed on the workshop's windowsill, pecking at the selection of seeds James had begun leaving out. They both watched it, this small sign of trust from the natural world. "I'll need to go into town," James said after a while. "Get some proper paperwork sorted." His voice held no shame, only practical consideration. "Been a while since I had official employment." Sarah nodded, understanding all he wasn't saying. "I'll make some calls. Have my lawyer handle the details." She smiled slightly. "Unless you think that's too much corporate interference?" He chuckled, the sound warm in the workshop's quiet space. "Sometimes the right tools make the job easier, even if they come from different worlds." The maple bowl sat unfinished on the lathe, a testament to work in progress. Like the cabin, like their growing friendship, it held the promise of something taking shape, something genuine emerging from raw material and careful attention. The business card slipped from Sarah's wallet as she reached for cash to pay for their hardware store supplies. It fell face up on the counter, its embossed lettering catching the fluorescent light. "Sarah Mitchell, CEO, Mitchell Technologies." Before she could snatch it back, James had already seen it, his expression shifting like shadows across still water. "Mitchell Technologies," he repeated softly, the words carrying the weight of recognition. Even in his years on the street, he'd seen the company's logo everywhere, on smartphones, laptops, billboards advertising the future of technology. The same last name as the cabin's previous owner wasn't coincidence. Sarah felt the carefully constructed balance between them tilt. All these weeks, she told herself the omission wasn't quite a lie. She was still Sarah, still the woman who sat in his restored kitchen drinking coffee from mismatched mugs. But looking at his face now, she realized how much their relationship had been built on the illusion of equality. "James," she started, but he was already moving, gathering their purchased supplies with mechanical precision. "We should get these back," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "That roof beam won't fix itself." The drive back to the cabin was silent, autumn colors blurring past the car windows. Sarah's hands gripped the steering wheel too tightly, her mind racing through corporate crisis management strategies before she caught herself. This wasn't a business problem to be solved with practiced efficiency. James spoke only when they pulled up to the cabin. "I need some time," he said quietly, lifting the supplies from the trunk. "To think." Sarah watched him walk toward the workshop, his shoulders straight despite the burden he carried. She'd seen that posture before, dignity under pressure, strength in the face of unexpected blows. It was what had first drawn her to him, though she hadn't understood that until now. Inside her laptop bag, dozens of emails demanded attention. Her assistant had flagged 3 as urgent, and the board would be expecting her quarterly projections soon. But for the first time since taking over as CEO, Sarah let them wait. Instead, she walked the property's perimeter, trying to see it through. New eyes. The garden James had started was taking shape. Winter vegetables pushing through soil he'd enriched with composted leaves. Every repair, every improvement spoke of care and attention to detail. He'd treated the cabin with respect, not because it belonged to a billionaire CEO, but because he saw its inherent worth. When sunset painted the sky in shades of amber and gold, Sarah found James sitting on the porch steps, turning something over in his hands. As she drew closer, she recognized her business card, its crisp edges now softened by handling. "I Googled you," he said without looking up. "Forbes cover last year. Tech's rising star reshaped Silicon Valley." His voice held no accusation, just a bone-deep weariness. $38 billion company makes my construction business look like a kid's lemonade stand. "James, let me finish," he said gently. "I've been sitting here thinking about all the times you could have mentioned it, all the times you watched me work on this place, probably thinking how you could replace everything with top-of-the-line materials. Could have hired the best contractors in the country, but I didn't want—" "No," he agreed, finally meeting her eyes. "You didn't. That's what I keep coming back to. You let me work with salvaged wood and second-hand tools. Let me cook you soup in chipped bowls. Why?" Sarah sank down beside him on the steps, careful to maintain the space between them. "Because you saw what this place could be without knowing its market value. Because every repair you made honored what was here before." She touched her mother's locket. "Because for the first time since Mom died, I found someone who valued things the way she did." James was quiet for a long moment, watching the last light fade from the sky. When he spoke again, his voice was thoughtful. "You know what the hardest part of being homeless was? Not the cold, not the hunger. It was becoming invisible. People look right through you like you're part of the background." He turned the business card over one more time before holding it out to her. "These past weeks, you saw me. Really saw me. Was that real, at least?" Sarah took the card, crumpling it in her fist. "The only time I feel real is here. With you. In my world, I'm not much different from those smartphones we make. A product to be marketed, a brand to be managed." She laughed softly, without humor. "The press calls me tech's rising star. But you're the only person who's asked me what I actually want." A whip-poor-will called in the gathering darkness, its lonely song echoing through the trees. James stood slowly, his knees cracking from sitting too long. "I should go," he said. "The truth's out now, time to face reality." "This is reality," Sarah said, rising to stand beside him. "Everything else, the corporate games, the power plays, the endless acquisitions, that's the illusion. Please," her voice caught, "don't let my name change what we've built here." James looked at the cabin, at all the work they'd done together. In the dark, it glowed with warmth from the repaired windows, looking exactly as he'd imagined it could. "I need time," he said again, but softer now, "to figure out if I'm still the man who can see what things are worth, or if I've just been fooling myself." He gathered his few possessions quickly, efficiently. Sarah watched from the porch as he walked down the drive, his figure growing smaller, until the darkness swallowed him completely. She stood there long after he'd gone, holding her crumpled business card and wondering how something as insubstantial as a name could tear down walls stronger than any he'd rebuilt. The town's overnight shelter felt like a step backward, though James knew it was a far cry from his darkest days. He sat on the narrow cot, filling out job application forms with painstaking care. His work at the cabin had restored more than just his strength. It had given him back his sense of professional pride. Still, explaining the gaps in his employment history remained a delicate task. "Previous position," he murmured, pen hovering over the line. How to describe his work at the cabin: property restoration specialist, unauthorized caretaker. The truth was more complicated than any form could capture. Across the room, the shelter's TV droned quietly, showing a tech conference where industry leaders discussed the future of digital innovation. James barely glanced up until a familiar voice caught his attention. Sarah stood at a podium, perfectly composed in a tailored suit, speaking about Mitchell Technology's latest breakthrough. "Our mission has always been about connecting people," she was saying. But James could see the subtle tension in her shoulders, the way her hand kept straying toward where her mother's locket would be, hidden beneath her corporate armor. Miles away, in her Boston penthouse, Sarah stared at the cabin's maintenance logs on her laptop. James had documented everything meticulously: materials used, repairs completed, plans for future improvements. His handwriting was steady, his notes precise and professional. Between the lines of technical details, she could read his deep understanding of the property, his respect for its history. Her phone buzzed with another message from her assistant. The board was concerned about her recent absences, her distraction during meetings. How could she explain that the only time she felt truly focused was when discussing roof repairs and garden planning with a man who'd seen through all her carefully constructed facades? "Ms. Mitchell," her assistant's voice came through the intercom. "The investment team is waiting for your decision on the Silicon Valley acquisition." Sarah closed the maintenance logs with a heavy heart. "Tell them I need to review the environmental impact reports again." Another delay tactic, buying time, while her mind wandered to a simple cabin where decisions were made based on what was right, not what looked good to shareholders. At the shelter, James pulled out the journal from his backpack. Not the cabin's renovation journal, but a new one he'd started. Its pages held sketches of improvements he'd planned but hadn't completed. A greenhouse built from salvaged windows, a workshop expansion using reclaimed timber, a restored garden path with native stone. "Excuse me?" a shelter volunteer approached. His cot. "There's a contractor looking to hire experienced workers. Interested?" James looked down at his half-completed application forms. The contractor's job would be honest work, a step back toward stability, but he knew it wouldn't involve the kind of thoughtful restoration he'd found at the cabin, where every repair honored the original craft while making it stronger. In her office, Sarah found herself doing something she'd never done before, searching online for articles about homelessness, about how people rebuilt their lives after losing everything. The statistics were grim, but the success stories shared a common thread. Someone had looked past circumstances to see the person underneath. She opened her email, starting a message to James before stopping herself. What could she say that wouldn't sound condescending coming from her position of privilege? How could she explain that his simple soup had nourished something in her that five-star restaurants never touched? The shelter's common room was quiet as James sketched by lamplight. His drawings had evolved from simple repair notes to something more personal, a vision of the cabin as it could be, a sanctuary that bridged past and present. In the margins, he wrote observations about the property's natural rhythms, when the morning light hit the kitchen windows, how the prevailing winds affected the garden plans, which trees needed attention before winter. Sarah's assistant knocked softly before entering her office. "Your father's on line 1. He's asking about the cabin. Apparently someone from the Historical Society contacted him about its restoration." The news hit Sarah like a physical blow. Of course the story would spread, would eventually reach her father's ears. The cabin had been his wife's retreat, after all. How could she explain what it had become now? How it had helped heal not just the property, but the people who found their way there. James stood at the shelter's window, watching early snow begin to fall. He knew the cabin's roof would hold. He'd reinforced it himself. The garden would need protection from frost. The pipes would need checking. All the little tasks that came with caring for a place properly. Tasks that had given his days meaning beyond mere survival. In Boston, Sarah touched her mother's locket, remembering how she'd once told her daughter that true worth couldn't be measured in dollars. "Find work that matters," she'd said. "Find people who see the real you." Two people in different cities, separated by circumstance, but connected by their understanding of what made something valuable. Their shared journal lay open on Sarah's desk, James's practical notes intertwined with her business-trained observations, creating something greater than either could have managed alone. The social media post went viral overnight. Tech billionaire's secret cabin romance with homeless handyman. Someone at the hardware store had connected the dots, the business card, the local newspaper article, the frequent visits of the familiar-looking woman in designer casual wear. Within hours, the story exploded across platforms, each retelling more sensational than the last. Sarah's PR team scrambled to contain the situation, but the narrative had already taken on a life of its own. Her phone lit up with notifications, reporters seeking comments, board members demanding explanations, social media managers trying to craft the perfect response. The headlines grew increasingly bold. Mitchell Technologies, CEO's hidden mountain. Life to billionaire heiress falls for homeless hero. Real-life fairy tale or corporate scandal. James discovered the story when he overheard two shelter volunteers discussing it during breakfast. His first instinct was to disappear. He'd had plenty of practice at becoming invisible, but something stopped him. The news coverage, though, sensationalized, couldn't erase what was real, the restored cabin, the honest work, the genuine connection they'd built. At Mitchell Technologies headquarters, Sarah sat in yet another emergency meeting, watching her carefully constructed professional world collide with her private sanctuary. "We need to get ahead of this," her chief of communications insisted. "Frame it as a humanitarian initiative. Corporate responsibility in action. Your mother's charity foundation could—" "No." Sarah's voice cut through the boardroom chatter. "I won't turn this into a PR stunt." Ms. Mitchell, another executive, leaned forward. "The market is already reacting. Our stock dropped 3 points this morning. Investors are concerned about your judgment." Sarah opened her laptop, pulling up the cabin's maintenance logs. "Let me show you something about judgment," she said quietly. "These are the restoration records from the cabin. Every repair documented, every material sourced responsibly, every decision made with long-term sustainability in mind. Tell me, how many of our corporate projects show this level of careful consideration?" The room fell silent as she scrolled through James's detailed notes and drawings. Even in their professional format, his passion for the work shone through. This wasn't the impulsive project the media portrayed, but a thoughtful resurrection of something valuable. At the shelter, James found himself surrounded by reporters. They wanted the fairy tale, the rags-to-riches story that would sell papers and generate clicks. Instead, he showed them his new journal, filled with technical drawings and material. "Calculations. You want to know what this story is really about?" he asked, his voice steady. "It's about seeing worth where others see waste, about rebuilding what's broken instead of throwing it away." The reporters exchanged glances, sensing a different angle than they'd expected. One of them, an older woman with kind eyes, asked, "Did you know who she was when you started the restoration?" "I knew she was someone who valued honest work," James replied. "Everything else was just details." The story shifted as more details emerged. Local contractors came forward, praising the quality of the restoration work. The Historical Society released a statement about the cabin's significance and the sensitivity of its rehabilitation. Even Martha, from the general store, spoke to reporters about how the project had respected the property's heritage. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from her father. "Your mother would have understood." Attached was a photo she'd never seen before. Her mother sitting on the cabin's porch, much younger, smiling at the camera while holding a garden trowel. The simplicity of the image brought tears to her eyes. The media circus continued, but something unexpected began to happen. Between the sensational headlines, a different narrative emerged. People shared stories of their own restoration projects, of finding purpose in rebuilding what others had abandoned. The cabin became a symbol of something larger, a counterpoint to the disposable nature of modern life. James watched it unfold from the shelter's common room, declining interviews but continuing to work on his plans. The greenhouse design was nearly complete, incorporating salvaged materials in ways that honored both function and history. He knew Sarah would understand his vision, even if their worlds had been forced apart. In her office, Sarah made a decision. She called her assistant. "Cancel my appointments for the next week," she paused, touching her mother's locket, "and contact the Historical Society. It's time to tell the real story, not about a billionaire and a homeless man, but about how genuine value isn't always measured in dollars." The media storm raged on, but at its heart lay a truth no headline could capture. Two people had found authenticity in an old cabin, had rebuilt more than just walls and windows. The question wasn't whether their different worlds could coexist, but whether the world was ready to understand what they'd discovered about true worth. The architectural plans lay spread across the cabin's kitchen table, weighted down by mugs of steaming coffee. Sarah had brought them up from Boston, professional drawings that incorporated James's original sketches, blending modern sustainability with traditional craftsmanship. It had taken 3 weeks to arrange this meeting, to find a way past the media circus and their own hesitations. "The greenhouse design," Sarah said, pointing to the detailed renderings. "We kept everything from your plans. The salvaged windows, the stone foundation, even the way you wanted to angle it to catch the morning light." James studied the drawings with a craftsman's eye. His rough sketches had been transformed into precise technical documents, but the soul of his vision remained intact. "You didn't change it," he said quietly, surprise evident in his voice. "Why would I?" Sarah's response was equally soft. "You understood what this place needed better than any architect could." She pulled out another set of plans. "But I did have them add something. Look." The new drawing showed an expanded workshop space, designed to serve as both a functioning woodshop and a teaching area. The plans incorporated large windows, workbenches, and space for small groups to gather. "A restoration school?" James looked up, questioning. Sarah nodded, her fingers unconsciously finding her mother's locket. "The Historical Society's been flooded with calls since the story broke. People want to learn traditional building techniques, how to restore old properties properly." She hesitated. "They need someone who understands both the technical skills and the importance of preserving history." James ran his hand over the plans, feeling the texture of the paper beneath his fingers. Since the media storm had forced them apart, he'd taken a job with a local contractor, earning honest wages, but missing the deeper satisfaction he'd found at the cabin. "You're offering me a teaching position." "I'm offering you a partnership," Sarah corrected. "The cabin would be the school's first project, a living example of proper restoration techniques. Students would learn by doing, helping to complete the work you started." Outside, early winter snow dusted the mountain slopes. The cabin stood warm and solid around them, every repair James had made holding strong against the cold. Through the window, they could see the garden he'd started, now properly winterized, waiting for spring. "It won't be easy," he said finally. "The media attention, the questions about our relationship, your board's concerns. Nothing worthwhile ever is." Sarah smiled slightly. "You taught me that, watching you repair this place piece by piece." She pulled out one final document, a deed to the property, newly drawn up to create a trust. The cabin and its grounds would be preserved for educational purposes, protected from future development. "We both know this place is more than just a building," she said. "It's a chance to show people that some things are worth saving, worth rebuilding." James thought of his early days at the cabin, how restoring its broken pieces had helped restore his own sense of purpose. "The students," he said slowly, "they'll need to understand it's not just about the techniques. It's about seeing the value in things others might discard, Like seeing the CEO beneath the corporate facade? Sarah's question held a hint of vulnerability. Or the craftsman beneath the circumstances? Their eyes met across the table, understanding flowing between them. The past weeks of separation had clarified something. Their connection wasn't despite their differences, but because of how those differences had allowed each to see the other clearly. James reached for the plans again, this time with purpose. "The workshop needs a few adjustments," he said, pulling out a pencil. "If we're teaching traditional techniques, the layout should reflect the natural workflow." Sarah watched as he began sketching modifications, his confident strokes showing. Years of practical experience. This was what had drawn her to him. Not just his skill, but his deep understanding of how things worked, how they could be made better while honoring their original purpose. As the afternoon light faded, they continued working on the plans together. Sarah's business acumen merged with James's practical knowledge, creating something neither could have achieved alone. The cabin wrapped them in its warmth, witness to another kind of restoration taking place, the careful rebuilding of trust between two people who had found in each other something genuine and worth preserving. The board meeting minutes lay stark on Sarah's desk, their formal language barely masking the underlying controversy. Concerns raised regarding CEO's judgment and commitment to corporate priorities. Discussion of potential impact on shareholder. Confidence. Motion to review leadership structure. Outside her office windows, Boston's financial district sparkled in the winter sunshine, a world of glass and steel that seemed increasingly distant from the authentic life she'd discovered. At the cabin, her tablet chimed with another message from the PR team, suggesting yet another strategy to reshape the narrative. Ms. Mitchell, her assistant's voice carried unusual hesitation. "The majority shareholders are requesting an emergency meeting. They're bringing in your father." Thomas Mitchell's return from semi-retirement sent ripples through the corporate offices. Sarah watched from her window as his familiar town car pulled up to the building. She hadn't seen him since the media storm began, since the story of the cabin and James had broken. Their few phone conversations had been brief, carefully avoiding the subject that now dominated business news. "Sarah," her father's voice was gentle as he entered her office, dismissing her assistant with a nod. He looked older than she remembered, more vulnerable somehow. "The board tells me you've been distracted." "I've been focused," she corrected, turning to face him, "just not on what they think I should be." Thomas crossed to her desk, picking up the board meeting minutes. His eyes scanned the carefully worded criticism, the veiled threats. They're worried about the company's image, a CEO who spends her time renovating cabins with... He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Unconventional partners." "What would Mom think?" Sarah asked quietly, touching her locket. "About what the company's become, about how we measure success." Her father's expression softened. He reached into his jacket, pulling out a worn envelope. "I found these while going through her things. Never had the heart to look at them before." Inside were photographs from the cabin's early days. Sarah's mother knelt in the garden, laughing as she taught a young Sarah to plant tomatoes. Another showed her father, sleeves rolled up, helping repair the porch steps. They looked happy, genuine, unburdened by the corporate empire that would later consume their lives. "The board's waiting," Thomas said finally. "They want assurances. That you'll refocus on business priorities, that you'll distance yourself from recent developments." Sarah stood, gathering the restoration school proposals she'd prepared. "Then let's not keep them waiting." The boardroom fell silent as she entered with her father. Faces that had once shown only deference now held challenge, judgment. Sarah took her place at the head of the table, spreading out her documents with deliberate care. "You've all seen the headlines," she began. "Read the speculation about my judgment, my priorities. Now let me show you something else." She started her presentation, displaying images of the cabin's transformation. "This is what sustainable growth looks like. This is what happens when we value quality over quick profits, authenticity over market trends." Charts and projections appeared on the screens, not just restoration costs and projected revenues from the school. but metrics of social impact, community engagement, environmental sustainability. While we've been chasing quarterly profits, we've forgotten what made this company great. My father didn't build Mitchell Technologies just to make money. He built it to make things that mattered. Thomas Mitchell stirred in his seat, his eyes fixed on a photo of his late wife's garden, now carefully tended by James. Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger. The cabin project isn't a distraction from our mission. It's a reminder of what that mission should be. This is all very touching, one board member interrupted. But we're running a technology company, not a historical preservation society. And your association with this homeless man? Master craftsman, Sarah corrected firmly, a man who saw value where others saw only market potential. Just like Dad did when he started this company in our garage, building computers that would last instead of disposable units that would need replacing every year. She turned to her father, seeing in his eyes a recognition of truths long forgotten. We've lost our way, she said softly, chasing stock prices. We've forgotten about building things that endure. The cabin project isn't just about restoration, it's about remembering who we are, what we could be again. The boardroom remained silent as Sarah laid out her full vision, a corporate responsibility initiative that would revolutionize their approach to sustainability, starting with the restoration school, but expanding to influence their entire production philosophy. It wasn't just damage control, it was a fundamental shift in how they defined success. Hours later, after the arguments and negotiations had exhausted themselves, Sarah stood at her office window again. Her father joined her, both watching the city lights emerge in the gathering dusk. Your mother would be proud, he said simply. Not of the company's success, though that matters, too, but of you, finding your way back to what's real. Sarah smiled, feeling the weight of her mother's locket against her heart. The board had ultimately backed down, swayed by Thomas Mitchell's unexpected support and Sarah's passionate defense. But she knew the real victory wasn't in the boardroom. It was in remembering that true worth couldn't be measured in stock prices alone. The deed to the cabin lay unsigned on the kitchen table, its legal language a stark contrast to the warmth of the wood-burning stove and the smell of fresh coffee. Outside, the first serious snow of winter transformed the mountain landscape into a pristine white canvas. James stood at the window, watching his breath fog the glass, as Sarah explained the final details of their arrangement. The trust ensures the property can never be commercially developed, she said, her corporate polish softened by the cabin's rustic setting. The restoration school will have full access to the grounds, and you'll have complete autonomy over the teaching program. James traced a pattern in the condensation on the window, remembering how he'd restored its frame with salvaged wood and hand-mixed putty. Every inch of this place held memories of renewal, not just of the building, but of himself. And you? He asked quietly, turning to face her. Where do you fit in this plan? Sarah's hand went to her locket, a gesture that now seemed as much habit as comfort. She'd shed her usual business attire for jeans and a sweater, looking more like the woman in her mother's old photos than the CEO who'd recently faced down her board of directors. That depends, she said carefully, on whether there's still room for me here. Not as the owner, not as a billionaire, but as someone who's learned to see value the way you do. From his pocket, James withdrew a small object wrapped in a cloth. He'd been working on it in secret during the weeks of their separation, in the hours between his regular contracting job and planning the restoration school. I made something, he said, placing it on the table beside the deed. Before you make any final decisions. Sarah unwrapped the cloth to reveal a wooden box small enough to fit in her palm. The wood was maple, like his first practice piece, but this showed months of increased skill. The grain flowed seamlessly across the joints, and a delicate pattern of carved leaves wrapped around its edges. Open it, James encouraged softly. Inside, nestled in a bed of velvet, lay a wooden pendant carved to match the design of her mother's locket. The craftsmanship was exquisite, each detail speaking of hours of patient work. "It's not gold," James said, his voice carrying the same quiet pride she'd first noticed when he showed her his cabin repairs. "Won't impress anyone at your corporate gatherings, but it's made from the maple branch that fell during our first storm here, the one that taught me sometimes things fall apart so they can become something new." Sarah lifted the pendant, feeling its lightness, its organic warmth so different from her usual jewelry. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Like this place." James gestured around them. "It's not about the material value, it's about the care put into making it, about seeing the possibility in things others might overlook." He paused, gathering his courage. "The way you saw possibility in me." Sarah set the pendant down and picked up the deed. The terms were clear. James would become the restoration school's master instructor and property manager, preserving both the cabin's structure and its spirit. But there was a space left blank, the section determining her own future involvement. "When I first bought this cabin," she said, "I thought I was just preserving a piece of my mother's memory. I never expected—" She looked around at the home they'd created together, "to find something real of my own here." James stepped closer, his calloused fingers brushing against the carved pendant. "Real things take work," he said. "Need maintenance? Care honest attention." His eyes met hers. "Thing is, I'm good at that kind of work. Always have been." Snow continued to fall outside as they stood in the kitchen, where they'd first shared simple soup and profound truths. The deed waited for signatures that would determine not just the cabin's future, but their own. Between them lay the wooden pendant, a bridge between their worlds, crafted with the same care that had restored both the cabin and their hearts. "I can't promise it will be easy," Sarah said, thinking of the corporate challenges still ahead, the media attention that might never fully fade. "My world won't stop trying to complicate things." James smiled, the expression crinkling the corners of his eyes. "Good thing I know something about handling complications, about taking what's broken and making it stronger." He picked up the pen beside the deed. "Question is, are you ready to build something real together?" The wedding invitation captured their story perfectly, a hand-drawn illustration of the cabin surrounded by the gardens they'd built together, with delicate wood-grain patterns bordering the text. They'd kept it small, intimate, celebrating, at the place where their worlds had first collided and then merged. Martha from the general store cried during the ceremony, held on the restored front porch where James had once contemplated his uncertain future. She wasn't alone. Many of the town's residents who'd watched their story unfold found themselves wiping away tears as Sarah, wearing her mother's locket alongside James's wooden pendant, exchanged vows with the man who'd taught her the true meaning of value. The restoration school had opened 2 months earlier, its first class of students already making progress on renovating a 19th century barn down the road. James moved among them now during the reception, discussing techniques and sharing the wisdom he'd gained through years of honest work. His students included both young apprentices and experienced contractors looking to learn traditional methods, all of them drawn by the authenticity they'd discovered was still possible in a disposable world. Sarah's father stood chatting with local craftsmen, his corporate demeanor softened by genuine interest in their traditional techniques. Mitchell Technologies had launched a new initiative under Sarah's leadership, a commitment to sustainable manufacturing and repairable design that was already changing how the industry thought about planned obsolescence. "Did you ever imagine this?" Sarah asked James as they shared a quiet moment in the kitchen, away from their celebrating guests. The space still held memories of that first bowl of soup, though now the shelves were properly stocked and the garden provided fresh vegetables for more elaborate meals. James smiled, running his hand along the counter he'd restored. "Not in detail," he admitted, "but I knew something real was happening here, could feel it in every repair, every choice we made." Through the window they could see their guests, mingling on the grounds, corporate executives talking with local builders, society figures learning about traditional crafts from James's students. The boundaries between their worlds had blurred, creating something new and stronger. The local paper's coverage this time was different from the sensational headlines of the past. Restoration School Bridges, Past and Future. The article featured interviews with students who spoke about rediscovering the value of craftsmanship, of taking time to do things right. James's philosophy of seeing worth in what others overlooked had sparked a movement that extended far beyond the cabin's grounds. Sarah's board had finally come around, seeing the marketing potential in their company's shift towards sustainable design and repairable products. But more importantly, they'd begun to understand the deeper truth she and James had discovered. That lasting value came from building things meant to endure. As evening approached, guests gathered in the new workshop space, its windows casting warm light onto the snow. James's students had surprised them with a gift, a handcrafted rocking chair made from reclaimed wood, each piece telling part of their story. The seat came from the cabin's original porch boards, the spindles from the maple tree that had yielded James's first practice pieces. Martha stood to make a toast, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd watched their story unfold from the beginning. "To Sarah and James," she said, raising her glass, "who reminded us that the best things in life aren't the ones that shine the brightest, but the ones that grow stronger with care and attention." The guests raised their glasses, but Sarah and James were lost in their own moment, sitting in their new rocking chair, surrounded by the life they'd built together. Her mother's locket and his wooden pendant caught the light, symbols of how their different worlds had become one. Outside, snow began to fall again, adding another layer to the mountain landscape. The cabin stood warm and welcoming against the gathering dark, its restored walls holding more than just memories now. They held the promise of a future where value wasn't measured in dollars, but in the care put into creating something meant to last. 1 year later, autumn painted the mountains in familiar golds and crimsons as James added the latest photos to the cabin's transformation album. The images told a story beyond mere renovation. They captured the birth of a movement that had started with one man seeing worth in what others had discarded. The first photo showed the cabin as he'd initially found it, broken and abandoned. Each subsequent image documented its revival, not just through repairs, but through the life that now filled it. Students practicing traditional joinery on the expanded porch. Sarah leading a corporate retreat focused on sustainable business practices. Local craftspeople sharing their knowledge with a new generation. "Still cataloguing our history?" Sarah asked, entering with 2 mugs of coffee. She'd just returned from a board meeting where Mitchell Technologies had announced its most successful quarter yet, driven by their new line of repairable, sustainable devices. The wooden pendant James had made her hung alongside her mother's locket, both catching the morning light. "Thinking about how much has changed," James replied, accepting the coffee. "The restoration school's wait list is 2 years long now. Had to turn down 3 more corporate training requests this month." Through the window, they could see the newest class of students working in the teaching garden, learning the rhythms of the land alongside traditional building techniques. The program had expanded beyond just construction. It now included sustainable living practices, traditional crafts, and the philosophy of restoration that had brought James and Sarah together. The local town had transformed as well. What started as one restored cabin had sparked a renaissance of traditional craftsmanship. Empty storefronts reopened as workshops, and the general store now featured a thriving artisan marketplace. Martha had become the unofficial historian of their story, telling visitors how a billionaire and a homeless man had reminded the community what really mattered. James opened to the latest photos, images of the graduation ceremony for their first class of restoration students. Among them was a former investment banker who'd left Wall Street to learn traditional woodworking, and a young woman from the homeless shelter where James had once stayed. Each graduate had gone on to start their own restoration projects, spreading the philosophy of sustainable renewal across the country. Sarah sat beside him, adding a new image to the album, the ultrasound picture they'd received just yesterday. Their first child, due in spring, would grow up understanding both worlds. The corporate responsibility Sarah continued to champion, and the honest craftsmanship James had never stopped teaching. "Mom would have loved all of this," Sarah said softly, touching her mother's locket. "The garden, the school, the way we've brought people together." James nodded, remembering the journal that had first taught him the cabin's rhythms. "We're just continuing what she started, seeing the value in this place, making it a home for more than just ourselves." The afternoon sun warmed the kitchen as they reviewed more photos. The homeless shelter where James had stayed was now partnering with the restoration school, offering scholarships and apprenticeships. Mitchell Technologies had created a foundation to support similar programs nationwide, proving that corporate success and social responsibility could coexist. Their story had evolved beyond the sensational headlines of the previous year. It wasn't just about a rich woman and a homeless man finding love. It was about rediscovering what gave life genuine worth. The cabin stood as testament to this truth, its restored walls containing not just their personal history, but the promise of a future where value was measured in more than money. As the sun set behind the mountains, James and Sarah sat in their handcrafted rocking chair on the porch, listening to the wind chimes that had witnessed their first conversations. The cabin glowed with warmth and purpose, every repair and improvement holding memories of their journey from broken pieces to something whole and real. The photo album lay open on their laps, telling a story that continued to unfold. It wasn't just their